your conversation with Pete Buttigieg yesterday about the border, is there anything that comes out of what happened at the Rainbow Bridge yesterday on a transportation sort of level, or just asking because I...
No, I mean, we have an excellent relationship, him and I, so whenever something happens, we connect directly. So,
separate question, the Port Toronto wants to extend the main runway at Toronto Island Airport. It's the overrun areas, and I believe there's a tripartite agreement between the city, the province, and the feds about not expanding that runway. Do you have any opinions on the matter with what the Port Authority wants to do?
I had discussions with the Port Authority, actually, including with Porter, because they're using the airport a lot. I listen to them, and we'll see. I'm open to.
Mr. Poilievre, actually.
Yes.
You're trying to. Your campaign promise was not to extend that runway. So are you now opening up that the runway could get extended?
I'm just saying that I'm listening to everything they have to do. And the first thing that's most important for everyone is safety. Is there anything in there concerning safety or anything like that? So,
Mr. Poilievre called it a terrorist attack before.
That
it was
very
actually
irresponsible.
Irresponsible? Why is that?
Because he didn't know. Because first, it's not. And the first job of a leader is to reassure Kenyans, not to make them panic. He did exactly the opposite. That's totally irresponsible.
Minister, what do you make of the Parti Québécois' popularity in Quebec right now?
Your leader used the word terrorist attack to qualify what happened in Niagara Falls yesterday in the House of Commons in French. Do you think that was too much?
I think the gravity of the situation spoke for itself when the Prime Minister left for a security briefing right away.
What do you think of the FCM asking for $600 million? Not necessarily from the federal government, but just in general, they say that's what they need for infrastructure funding. Do you think the government can help on this for new homes?
Obviously, the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure is in a better position to answer that than I am. I had a very good meeting with representatives, the President of the FCM, the big city mayors, caucus chair. I had a good discussion about our government's commitment to invest in housing. We talked about the Canada Community Building Fund, which used to be known as the gas tax transfer. My discussions with municipalities has been very constructive, and I think if they acknowledge that our government has been a valuable partner in investing in infrastructure, they would be saying something that's very accurate. Merci.
I understand the new trade agreement is not imposing carbon pricing on Ukraine, but do you regret even having that language in there given how volatile this has now become?
Well, let me say that every trade agreement that Canada has, which are high standard and progressive trade agreements, it's precisely because we have provisions in there that actually is around labor rights, providing opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses, and guess what? Also environmental protections. But I want to actually clarify that this paragraph in here is something not only a part of all of Canada's trade agreements, it's what Ukraine wants. And I think the Conservatives should be clear with Canadians why they're not supporting this, because Ukraine has already had a price on pollution since 2011. The Ukrainians came out today specifically to clarify this point, that this agreement does not put a price on pollution, doesn't require them to put a price on pollution. But as I said, they've already had one, but all of Canada's free trade agreements have these provisions because fighting climate change is economic policy.
But maybe if a country is being, attacked by Russia, this is perhaps not the time to throw this kind of language. Like they might have other commitments. Such as pushing back an invasion.
The Ukrainians asked Canada to negotiate a free trade agreement with them. I have asked them on all occasions leading up to the war and during. We should applaud the Ukrainians for being able to negotiate an agreement and also fight climate change and also look at their economic security. There are many Canadian companies. I was part of the Rebuild Ukraine conference just on Monday with many Canadian companies, but also international companies who want to be in Ukraine as part of the rebuild effort. This is a progressive, strong, high-standard free trade agreement that Ukraine wants. Ukraine has signed it. They want it. They asked for a modernization renegotiation back in 2019. It's taken time to do it because of COVID, but also because of the onset of the war. But boy, we should be applauding Ukraine for wanting to and negotiating a high standard trade agreement with Canada.
And you said, you suggested there is some other real reason the Conservatives voted against this. What is that? What are you hinting at?
I think you should ask the Conservatives, and I think Conservatives should be clear with Canadians about why it is that they decided to abandon Ukraine and decided to vote against this agreement.
They say it's carbon tax. You're saying that's not what it is, right?
Well, we have a free trade agreement that does not impose it. Ukraine has had a price on pollution since 2011. The Ukrainians came out today to clarify that it does not do that, so one should ask the Conservative Party why they abandoned Ukraine.
And just the focus of the actual agreement, this is about investments, so that when they rebuild after the war, that's part of it, and it's also, I understand, sunsetting clauses. Could you just walk us through those two?
So what was really important for the Ukrainians, given that they know that there will be a rebuild effort, they wanted a chapter in there that was about protecting investors. So that's why that's in there, and I think it's really good because they want to be able to create confidence among those who wish to invest in Ukraine to do so at the right time. I'm already seeing that. The other day, it was so encouraging. I saw over a couple hundred businesses as part of the Rebuild Ukraine conference. I spoke to the Deputy Prime Minister, Yulia Shrivadenko, on Monday as well, very much about how are we going to move this quickly through our parliamentary system. They're committed to do the same thing. I think suffice it to say that both Canada and Ukraine are committed to doing this next step with Ukraine. This is about their economic security. This is about their sovereignty. This is about who they want to trade with. And this is about creating the conditions so that businesses can very much be a part of the rebuilding in Ukraine. And I'm thrilled that I will take a business mission to Ukraine sometime in 2024.
And I just had one last question. The sunset clauses here, it's important to get this legislation through, not just the House, but also the Senate. I take it there's something on January 1st that might expire. Can you let me know what's actually expiring?
You know what? I am happy to get back to you on that very specific question. Suffice it to say that what we have here is a really it's an agreement that was negotiated in record time. I mean, and I hearken back to so many of the conversations I had with my Ukrainian counterparts before the war, certainly during the war, and how important these negotiations were for them. I remember them saying to me, when I asked the question, are you still ready? Do you still want to proceed? And they said, absolutely, because it's really important for Canada, a G7 country, to have confidence in Ukraine, and our economic security, we know, is going to be our ability to trade and to do business with a G7 country like Canada. We are committed to our future economic prosperity and security. We want to do that with Canada, and we did this, and we did this negotiation with sort of once we put the tables back together, we did in a year. So the fastest negotiations that I've done of a comprehensive free trade agreement. So I'm looking forward to standing with Ukraine, standing up for Ukraine, and you've seen that. The government has certainly voted in favor of this, and we're going to do everything we can to move this through the parliamentary process as expeditiously as we can. Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Thanks.
I'm here to express my absolute disappointment in the Liberal government's once again failure to address the ongoing crisis of gender-based violence in their fall economic statement. This past year, we found out that the Liberal government is cutting $150 million from shelters, money that was given during the pandemic. We know that rates of violence are rising. And what is this government doing? Cutting $150 million from shelters. Where are those fleeing violence supposed to go? Not one mention of housing. Now they're looking at putting it off till 2025. We know that one of the barriers, the biggest barriers to women and to us LGBTQIA fleeing violence is the financial ability to leave. Rent geared to income housing is a must if we're going to address gender-based violence. And what is the Liberal government doing? Waiting until 2025. You know, women and girls, to us LGBTQIA+ individuals shouldn't always be on the back burner of this government. The Liberal government who claims to be a feminist government. And MMIWG, like in 2020, this government in the fall economic statements, no plan to address the ongoing violence against murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Where is even the mention of potential investment, an investment into a crisis that this current Prime Minister has acknowledged as an ongoing genocide? We know that municipalities are calling gender-based violence, major municipalities, an epidemic. This government, their choice to sit by and watch while rates of violence increase. This is shameful. The NDP, along with me as the critic for women and gender equality, is going to be calling on this government to change the direction that we're seeing, potential direction we're seeing in the fall economic statement, to make sure that we can tackle gender-based violence once and for all. Thank you.
Sorry. Are you going to table your private member's bill about residential school denialism, and have you talked to the new minister about that?
There is something in the works. I don't have any further details to date, but there is something in the works right now.
Ms. Gazan, as Canada rapidly transitions to a green economy, there's increased investment in clean energy sector, which was included in the fall economic statement. However, the fall economic statement also emphasized that, or noted that these jobs in the sector are dominated by men. Are you concerned that this transition to clean energy is leaving women behind?
Well, I'm concerned that this whole Liberal government is leaving women behind. We certainly see that with the fact that no mention in this budget around shelters, around addressing the ongoing crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. You know, if we want to address gender-based violence, even in the resource sector, we did a study in the Status of Women Committee linking increase of violence against Indigenous women and girls and the resource sector, something that was unanimously supported across party lines. One of the recommendations spoke about the need to lift up women's voices, Indigenous women's voices, who are largely impacted in the resource sector. Clearly, this government in the false economic statement is once again neglecting that.
Is there anything else you suggest the government do to help address the directions taking in the clean energy sector?
Well, certainly gender equality is a huge issue, and they have to stop funding fossil fuels. You know, we know that it's no secret that the Liberal government is friends with the big corporations and oil and gas. The NDP has called on an end to all fossil fuel subsidies. I think it's fine time this government listens to that and does the right thing.
And what is the latest you've heard about the landfill search in Winnipeg? Have you spoken with the families lately about
Well, I know very fortunately we have a new NDP provincial government in the province of Manitoba that has indicated a commitment to supporting families in the search of the landfill. Certainly the municipalities have come on board, but let's be clear. Whatever the province or municipalities chose to do, the federal government has an obligation to ensure that human rights are upheld in Canada. I call on the federal government to stop studying and provide the resources and support needed to search the landfill. Thank you very much.
How are you today? Good to see you. I think you're reprising your role, Toronto role, to talk about Moss Park and Fort York, the armories. Is that correct?
I had a good conversation on Monday morning with Mayor Chow. We talked about Toronto's previous experience in using the armories as temporary shelters in 2004 and in 2019, and we both agreed that, quite frankly, that was not an appropriate use of that space. I explained to the Mayor, I thought quite clearly that over 3,000 Canadian Armed Forces members work out of those armories, and that the work they do is important. They're the same people that were available to be deployed into our long-term care facilities. They've helped us with forest fires and floods. Their training is really important. And the armories is not just simply an empty space. It's a training facility. It's where the office is. It's where our reserves, all based in Toronto, operate out of. The work that they do is important. And quite frankly, I'm very concerned that interrupting that work and that training could have a real impact on their capabilities. And at the same time, the Mayor and I talked about the fact that the City of Toronto has just so far this year closed 5 of its temporary shelter facilities that were housing those refugees. And we talked about the possibility of reopening some of those. And we talked about some other spaces in Toronto which were far more appropriate for use to accommodate these people as the winter approaches. Places, one of the problems that we had experienced previously with the shelters is they don't have adequate washroom facilities. It's not a private space. It is a place of work for the Canadian Armed Forces. We even store armaments in those buildings, and so the inappropriateness of the armories was a particular concern. As I even reflected in 2019, our housing advocates were quite vocal that living conditions in those armories were deplorable, was the language that they used. And I agree with that completely. There are far more humane, far more appropriate spaces in the City of Toronto, and we're quite prepared to work, IRCC, ourselves, our government, with the City of Toronto and the province. So I think we all have a responsibility here to work collaboratively together to get the right shelter situation for those individuals, and the armories are simply not that space.
So to be clear, you were very clear that you would not, the federal government would not offer the armories.
No, crystal clear. The conversation, I wasn't, I've known Mayor Chow for a very long time, and we've worked together in my previous role and in hers on issues around homelessness and helping people, particularly those who are living on the street in Toronto. We talked about how inappropriate the armories would be as a solution, and we talked about a number of other solutions. We talked very specifically about a number of addresses that the City of Toronto had used previously, other spaces that are far more appropriate for the housing of these individuals. We had that conversation. I undertook to continue to work with Mayor Chow, as we've always worked together.
Addresses other than the armories, do you think may be appropriate to
federal addresses, what we talked about is the Better Living Building, for example, on Princess Avenue. We talked about the One Place Hotel at 65 Dundas Street East, which up until just a few months ago was being used to shelter these individuals. There's 153 beds there, for example, and they have washrooms, and it can be kept as a secure facility. There's also other shelters. The City of Toronto made a decision earlier this year to close 5 of those shelters, and they're continuing to close shelters where refugees have been housed. Unfortunately, that has created a situation where it's put people out on the street. And so I think it is incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we treat those people fairly, that we give them a safe place where living conditions are not to be described as deplorable, but are actually provide them with facilities that are safe and secure, where they can be properly sheltered, but also where there's proper washroom facilities and other security facilities and health securities that they need in order to be safe.
I got to ask you about the Queen's Park side of things. Now, a City of Toronto request would have to come to Queen's Park before it comes to you to begin with, but it seems, is there a vacuum there that the Ford government needs to do more as well, or that Mayor Chow has come to you?
To be very clear, all 3 orders of government have a responsibility here, and we recognize that, and we're very much part of that discussion. Mayor Chow had indicated to me that she had considered the armory option. We discussed this at some length on Monday in a virtual conversation that we had about why that was an inappropriate solution, and that there were other better solutions available to the City of Toronto. I've worked for decades with Mayor Chow. We both know the city very well. We know particularly the downtown area where most of these shelters were located, not at all. And I believe very strongly and discussed with her that there are far better options that we should consider. I explained to Mayor Chow as well, but the cost of not making those, right now, those armories are very important to the Canadian Armed Forces. We have 3,000 people there. They train 7 days a week there. And if, by the way, they're not able to use those armories, they don't get paid. And those are the same people that we keep on calling upon in the long-term care facilities to fight fires, to help in floods. I need them. Canada needs them. And their training is critically important. And so we want to be able to continue to do that. I believe that there are many other options in the City of Toronto, and this is what Mayor Chow and I discussed. There are many other options that are far more appropriate, far more suitable to the requirement of housing the homeless, and particularly those refugees that are going to need shelter. There's an urgency to this discussion, but I think we need to move quickly, but we need to do it right. And getting those people into a shelter that's safe, that's appropriate, where there's adequate washroom facilities, cooking facilities, the quality of life. As I said, in 2019, and this was well reported, the housing activists in Toronto said that the conditions in those armories was deplorable. I don't think we should be seeking to replicate that mistake. I think we should be looking at appropriate alternatives. There were a number of alternatives that were in use in Toronto. As I said, the City of Toronto made a decision in December of 23, or December of 22, to then go about closing 5 of those shelters. They've done that. Some of those spaces are still available. Some of them have been sold to developers and are going to be turned into condos, I guess. But some of those spaces are still available, and I think we should be looking at those spaces and other spaces that are far more appropriate than the armories. Thanks very much.
Appreciate it.
Hi, Minister. Can I talk to you for a few minutes?
Yeah, what, have I got time before?
Sure.
Yeah.
There's confusion in Toronto whether or not Minister Miller has actually offered up the armories as a shelter for the homeless in that city. Can you provide any clarity on that? Is that in the works, something that you've been working on in your file?
That's being led by Minister Miller. Obviously, Minister Blair has something to say about it because armories are used for operational purposes as well. It's a decision that's being handled by the Minister of Immigration and the Minister of National Defence.
Do you see that there could be more federal properties that are standing empty that could be used as shelters as winter gets closer?
We're going through a list of properties that we hold federally to convert to housing more broadly. To the extent that there are local properties where there's an opportunity, of course, we would entertain those conversations. It's rare that we have a piece of federal property that's not being used for operational purposes that we could simply make available without jeopardizing the very real needs to continue to use those properties. To the extent communities across Canada are aware of properties that would be appropriate, of course, we will entertain all reasonable conversations.
All right, and I know that we talk about a lot about how you're increasing supply, but we know that increasing the housing supply is a solution that is years away. What are you doing, I guess, in the short-term solution that could be somehow dampening down demand?
Sure. So there's a number of different things that you can do to address the demand side of the equation. We cannot take our eyes off the prize, which is building more supply, but there are things we can do in the short term that are going to help. And some of them, by the way, tackle both supply and demand depending on what kind of demand. A good example would be some of the measures that we're putting in place to address short-term rentals by changing the nature of the purpose of those properties from something that's rented for a few days at a time to a tourist to a home that can be offered permanently for families. We're going to have to work with municipalities and provinces who have jurisdiction over the property use regulations that may be in place or bylaws, but I think by layering on top of them different tax treatment to reduce the supply of rentals, or not rentals, short-term rentals, to increase the supply on the market overall can certainly help.
Some would say the best solution in terms of reducing demand right away would be putting a cap somehow on international students. Is that something you've discussed with Minister Miller? How far ahead are we on those types of discussions as well with the universities?
We've discussed a number of different options to look at when it comes to some of our temporary programs. I think it's essential for people to understand the international student program is a blessing for Canada. It is injects nearly $25 billion to our GDP annually, but more importantly, it's a pipeline of future Canadian citizens who are going to make contributions to their communities. There are challenges, though, because not all institutions are using the program appropriately. There are some institutions across Canada that I believe are exploiting students for the private financial gains of the owners that are not providing with the supports that they need to succeed when they are here. That's not providing service to students, it's not providing a service to communities. We do have opportunities to establish a trusted partner model that Minister Miller has been working on to actually reward those good actors, including those who provide housing for students that come, by giving them preferential access to study permits and priority processing. If we change the rules, we can actually incentivize the kind of behavior that will allow institutions to provide for those students, and then we need to work with provincial governments who have the responsibility as to which institutions have access to the program so they can more effectively crack down on the bad actors that do exist. Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much, everyone.
Can I ask you, what do you think of your caucus mates' trip to Israel recently? Do you think that was a valid trip? Were they right to go on it?
I'm doing my work. I'm trying to represent my constituents, concentrating on my own work.
Does it send the wrong message when the Prime Minister is calling for maximum restraint by Israel for 2 Liberal MPs to then go there?
My position has been very clear, and I think it's really very important for Canada to be a strong voice in raising their voice for a ceasefire and making sure that we can put an end to the killing of the innocent Palestinian. We have lost kids, it's really horrifying. So I want to make sure that I continue to do my work and don't get distracted by those things. Thank you.